I've said enough for today, I think. Please welcome Korinna Hennig.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with you all, although we might have more fun with everyone in real life, not only in a digital conference, but anyway, this is what it's all about at the moment. So when I talk to you about what we experienced with science communication in the Corona crisis, I must say, for me, this is a story full of surprise. And as far as I consider this as a journalist, it is also a very encouraging story about what is possible far beyond from we thought it would be. But we also learned a lot about how journalism works in these times, especially when you look at what social media does, and that science communication is really difficult to practice on these platforms. Anyway, I don't think it's impossible, but it needs maybe even more care than long formats do. Well, I should tell you all this from the beginning. We started with an idea on this podcast that was a little different from what the podcast is now, or so to say, because we had to do various things somehow in a rush in the beginning. So maybe we only had a very roughly designed, only a sketched idea of what to do. So a few things developed just by chance, but during this process, we reflected a lot on them and then mostly decided willfully we would keep them and commit to them or change them thoroughly and even improve what already had begun. We started at the end of February 2020 in the last year, which is almost a year now, and we launched our podcast on the coronavirus as an interview podcast. It's a dialogue between me and the virologist Christian Drosten. And as you just heard from Simone, since the beginning of September, we also have a second expert in the podcast, the Frankfurt-based virologist Sandra Ciesek, who's now appearing weekly, alternately with Christian Drosten. It's no quick dialogue, and that's what's untypical for this form of science communication in mass media, I think. There are long passages where the expert may explain thoroughly without me interrupting him frequently. But the idea in the beginning was a little different. We have at North German Radio at NDR, we have an audio lab. It's sort of a think tank called Think Audio. And the developing head, Norbert Grundei, had the idea for this podcast. And he discussed it with us. And we thought it would be like 10 minutes every weekday, which is now a fact about which we love, because in the way we do it now, this would be impossible. And if someone of you has ever listened to the podcast, one can't imagine anymore Christian Drosten explaining things in 10 minutes. We knew then that Christian Drosten is the leading virologist on this topic in Germany, on coronaviruses and especially on SARS. He had already played a major role in the SARS-1 epidemic. And we also knew that Christian Drosten is a scientist who is very interested in communication, who, especially in times of crisis, tends to share his knowledge very soon, frankly, with the community. For example, he published the genome sequences as soon as he had them early last year and communicated it on Twitter. So Norbert asked him if he would do this podcast with us, and because we thought there might be a need for more information. And this is the first surprise. He immediately said yes, almost immediately. He answered briefly and very laconic, yeah, let's do it. We can start on Monday. And we were just like, we thought it was just a little, very small chance that he would say yes, and he did. So, and then we thought, well, then we should do it immediately. It took us like 1 or 2 days to organize everything, to make sure the podcast would get attention, which is sort of a political question I had to learn. You have to get on stage on iTunes, Spotify, and whatever there is, and our own platform. And we had to do the cover layout, provide Christian Drosten with the technical stuff. So there's a lot of workload on this. As a journalist, you normally do not have to deal with. And then it turned out that the timing was occasionally perfect. The night before we started the first episode, the first SARS coronavirus 2 cases emerged in Germany. Not exactly the first, but the first on which one could not make out a direct connection to China. The first cases were in Munich, but there was clear very quickly that there was a businesswoman from China, a colleague who had come for a visit. and who had been infected without knowing it. But then we had cases in other parts of the country. So by chance, we got all the attention we wanted. As I told you, it was intended to talk 10 minutes, but already on the first episode, it took us 30 minutes, although it was quite a conventional journalistic interview. We had not prepared anything with Christian Drosten. I just did my research and came up with my questions. But there were so many questions that came up one out of the other. I instinctively felt we should not do this any shorter. So this is what I call development by chance in the beginning, but it turned out to be good, to be what helped Christian Drosten and me to prevent everyone with information without reducing it so much that there might be misunderstandings. And what is even more, it turned out to be suitable for the audience. And this was the second surprise, because very soon we got feedback on this and people did not want us to give simple answers on complex questions. They just wanted it like that. I will explain this later in detail what that means for us. Another thing that happened somehow not initially on purpose and is quite unusual is that I did not interrupt Christian Drosten as often as journalists normally do in interviews. In the beginning, I must admit, this had partly had technical reasons because we are connected via an app and it is only doing the sound, so we do not see each other during the interview. And there is a little delay in hearing each other. So it's not that easy to interrupt in the right moment. This changed a little on the long run, especially after we had met personally for the first time in the summer. Getting used to how one talks usually makes things a little easier in this situation. And now I myself know a lot more and realize when it's urgently needed to explain what he's talking about. As I'm not a natural scientist, I have studied German literature and language and history, but I haven't studied biology or anything. So I had to get into this as well. So almost immediately the news about this podcast obviously spread all over the country because in fact, there seemed to have been a gap in the information landscape on the coronavirus as we thought in the beginning. So I should tell you a little about the content. Although some things came upon by chance, the content of the podcast developed. What we do now is we look out for subjects, for topics we believe people do not know enough about. And what is even more important, we look out for issues where scientific research is making progress or where questions are coming up science cannot answer yet, but where there is an important discussion on immunity or airborne infection, for example, in the beginning. Nowadays, it might more be the duration of immunity, reinfections, and of course, the impact of the variants circulating in England, South Africa, and Brazil on the incidence. The pandemic in general and the effects of vaccination, you all know these issues. Our sources are mainly studies, published ones in journals, as science journalists normally use, and preprints, not yet peer-reviewed. And this is where the scientists play a big role, because even for science journalists, it's not easy to sort them out. And it is not seldom that we talk about a study broadly quoted throughout media in the podcast by Christian Drosten, because he does a lot of research with his team on this special coronavirus, surprisingly raises questions on the study design and on issues that are not still answered in studies, questions I have not read anywhere before. So this is where you see we have a really thoroughly working, critically thinking and creative expert in the podcast, because this might as well be a talent that's not to be underestimated as is for a scientist. And sometimes our sources even include articles from science journalists. But I have made the experience that in general, mass media, you have to double check very carefully, because the whole situation seemed to be non-overseeable for a lot of people who normally work in politics or just any newsroom. So it's very difficult for the average journalist to provide the people with solid information. So there's a lot of outdated and obsolete or not quite correct or very one-sided information around, because there's this flood of preprint studies with sometimes low quality because journalists do not know enough about the needs on a correct study design. But also because journalists do not have the time mostly to reflect enough, to sort out when it might be important not to raise a topic at all. As you know, even a headline, which is put like a question, carries a message for a broadly concerned public that maybe is far from the fact. Another source, although it's quite limited, are the questions from the audience. There are questions the audience is encouraged to send us via email, and there are thousands of questions. I think the peak in early summer or in spring was like 2,000 emails a day. Most of them we can't answer because there are political questions or they do not fit into the special scientific portfolio of Christian Drosten and Sandra Ciesek. On masks, for example, which is a hygiene topic, which is not a special topic for a virologist, or on special technical air condition systems against viruses. But there's quite an amount we do discuss in the podcast. And last but not least, it helps us to sort out where there are main issues where people do not know enough and are especially concerned about. And sometimes, as the title of this lecture is Scientific Literacy Against Fake News, so sometimes we tackle fake news or things certain persons publish to play the whole cause down, the whole pandemic, to deny the danger the coronavirus might cause. We do not do this very often because it's always a decision where you should thoroughly weigh up the pros and cons, as it might draw too much public attention to those people. And some of them, as you can see, whenever you follow their traces through the internet, have very substantial commercial interests to raise attention. Therefore, we do not name these people, we just deal with it on the objective level. Both of us, we are the ones to explain, to understand every detail of a study and its design, and they are the ones who could judge best whether scientific research is serious and reliable. In a regular situation, as a research effort, we as journalists would probably call them or people like them for a first reaction, for an interview, and then afterwards write our report or article. But anyway, I do a lot of research by myself and even bring sources and studies into our dialogue by my own. I bring up questions and issues, and I'm the one who's doing the dramaturgy, the order in which we tackle the questions. In general, we now agree roughly what we will be talking about and about the sources and the studies, which in the beginning was different. We just did it on the run, but now we talk in advance, so I can prepare to keep on understanding and co-thinking while they explain, and to be able to transmit information to lay persons, to the normal ones among us, to translate difficult technical terms, although there are a lot of doctors and experts listening to us. So mostly, and this is what it's all important about, we do not give straight answers. And this is what surprises me a lot, that people do like this, obviously. Mostly we serve a background on the pandemic. And very often it gets quite complicated, very complex. Christian Drosten already very early in the pandemic reported on virus evolution, which was somehow like a lecture in a university class, because it was full of technical terms, and because especially Christian Drosten frequently does a deep dive into the studies we're talking about. So it's not only us presenting the results of the scientific research, but also a chance for the audience to learn how studies have to be read, to learn what is important on examination of the virus, to do follow-ups when you do a study, for example, what questions are important to raise when someone presents new findings. It's sort of, I would call, an enablement of the audience, but this also means it's not easy to have. I often try to translate and to communicate to get the whole course down to the earth in the end, down to our daily life. And Christian Drosten, for example, is very good at finding metaphors, explaining things vividly, illustrate them. But still, as we do not want to simplify, it remains complicated quite often. And on the other hand, Sandra Ciesek, the second expert, mostly provides a lot of basic knowledge to the people, a lot of things like, but how do these tests really work in detail? Or, but why is science so convinced that vaccines invade the body, do not invade the body, like getting into human genes and changing things there on the long term? And even this might not always be simple, but both of it people obviously seem to appreciate. So here comes what makes the whole podcast success story so astonishing. Very soon from the beginning, as I told you, the numbers of listeners climbed into spheres we would never have dreamt of. Until now, the podcast has been downloaded and streamed over 80 million times, which makes me still freezing. It's unbelievable for us. It does not mean it's 80 million listeners, because so far we've published 72 episodes. And when people are listening to every episode, of course, they are counted every time. But please keep in mind, we started with episodes of 30 minutes duration, and nowadays that we do not publish the podcast daily anymore, but once a week. The episodes tend to be like 90 minutes. A few times they were almost 10 hours long. 2 hours long, I'm sorry, not 10 hours, this would be too much. So, but 2 hours, and that's quite a bit of pure science. A lot of response, as I told you, is what makes me so surprised, because this is really unusual. People keep writing us just to say, thank you, I like this, keep on, please go on, please don't make it shorter. They keep telling us, I'm really concerned, sometimes I'm even scared by the pandemic, but listening to the podcast calms me down. It enables me to make my own decisions on the base of the background knowledge I get from Drosten and Sandra Ciesek. And this is really seldom in media, especially these days when complaining about things until insulting people without having to face their reaction has become so easy on social media. So it's really seldom that people send emails or call or even write letters just to say thank you without any more requests. As journalists, we are used to situations where normally only the discontented people get in touch, the ones who want to criticize or even insult us. And this time it's just the other way around. And what also surprises us is that a lot of people keep on listening. The episodes, as I told you, got longer over the time. Some only these days remark that now that we almost reached the 2 hours benchmark, it tends to become a little too long for them. But still others beg us to take as much time as it needs to explain all that's necessary to be addressed at the moment. And the advantage of a podcast is, of course, that you can stop whenever you like and continue listening the next day or after an hour, whenever, however you want it. Of course, there's more audience with higher education listening to the podcast, but it's not exclusively like that. We also have janitors listening to us, as I can tell from personal emails I receive. And they come from all ages, literally from 8 to 80 years. And remarkably, we have quite an amount of older women, retired women, for example, who are normally not the special interest audience who listens to science podcasts, at least as far as we know. As I told you, there are a lot of questions we can't answer, but politics obviously does not either. So I think there is a huge lack of detailed information on states' behalf and in media, because normally there's very little space and time. In newspapers, you only have like half a page if it's a lot, or a quarter of a page. And on the radio where I work, you get maybe 3 or 4 minutes, which makes science communication pointing out open questions and doubts almost impossible. So I know I frequently talk to you about the success, and this is not going to be some PR lecture I want to give you here. So I want to talk about the problems and the learnings we have from that situations. Sometimes we get in conflict with colleagues, especially from social media. We frequently have to argue with other journalists, even from our own broadcasting company, because they take up small pieces from complex explanations, and by cutting them out, distort them. This is really difficult, especially for Drosten and Sandra Ciesek. Maybe a little more for Drosten, because he's the one who's more famous in Germany, who gets into the focus of special interests very often. Mostly, of course, this distortion in media does not happen on purpose, but only because journalists do not have enough time for research, and they do not know enough, because science is a very complicated thing. And Sometimes, I'm sorry to say it that rudely, some are too lazy to do a deep dive into the whole thing or to try to rethink a problem by themselves. And sometimes the editorial staff tend to wish to report on topics all the others do as well in media, like, for example, if the Telegraph is passing that issue to the people, we also have to do it. In Germany, sometimes it's the Bild Zeitung. Even if we do not have enough news, real news and reliable news to tell, just to be part of the game. So one is copying the other. So media sometimes is replicating themselves like viruses do. I think quite often there's very little conscience of what we all are doing here in media. Unfortunately, science in almost all situations is the opposite of what tabloid press does. The one literally excludes the other. So I think there is very scarcely news in the corona pandemic you can press into a headline so far. And also politicians often do not want to take responsibility retrospectively. So they hold scientists responsible for what they, the politicians, decided. And if it turned out to be the wrong decision, or even only because certain people claim it to be the wrong decision, some politicians don't want to take the responsibility. And they decided obviously on the ground of what science told them, but of course you need more than one discipline. It's not only the virologist, for example, to decide whether schools are to be closed. So you cannot let a virologist alone decide on the education of children, and you won't. You will also listen to education researchers and teachers and pediatrics. And of course, frequently afterwards, politics does not follow the narrow epidemiologic advice from virologists. And some media even have politically driven agendas. So Christian Drosten, for example, suffered a lot from that. Even personally, he was attacked and threatened. And as I told you, people held him responsible. But again, he's not the one who's making the political decisions. So this means for us, apart from our responsibility for the content and for the audience, in this situation, we also have a special and very unusual responsibility for our experts to prevent them from being misunderstood, misinterpreted, and too much exposed personally. And of course, as I mentioned, we sometimes had to deal with fake news and conspiracy theories by people who misuse the publishing platforms of our podcast for their own agenda, even for commercial interest. This happens a lot on YouTube, for example. But these conflicts, put together with the response from the audience who testified to the complete opposite, confirms us that what we are doing is the right way. So here I come to the learnings from the whole story. I believe as journalists, we should not underestimate our audience. A lot of them are willing to listen to things that are not simplified, not downsized when they are important to them. And we are the ones who have to explain why things are important for them, we as journalists. And science journalists in mass media are used to editorial conferences where their colleagues say, oh, well, this is far too complicated. Where is the relevance? People won't understand this. But now we see, yes, there is a way much more often than we thought if we make the effort to explain things. And of course, if people are really interested. So I must admit, there's one restriction to this learning. The pandemic, of course, is a very special situation, a situation of general concern. And hopefully we will not have a situation like this too soon again after the whole pandemic has come to an end, or sort of an end. But might not be the climate change, the climate crisis, a crisis of general concern as well, where science journalism should fit in a little better, should get a little more space, some more chances to pass information to the people. What I learned is we should refrain from suggesting answers too fast where there are no answers yet, because open questions might be information too, and this is really important. This is what I experienced, that people even confirm us that the communication of open questions, pointing out where they are and why it might be very important and could as well help to come through a difficult and sometimes frightening situation. It might help to calm down a little For example, when Boris Johnson all of a sudden says the new variant of the virus is more lethal by a certain factor, it might help to calm down a little if we help to sort out that there is little information behind this statement, that there is a lot of uncertainty in the database, and that might even be less worse than the Prime Minister just communicated. Although we can't tell this definitely, we can only say there might be. So clarification, enlightenment is so important in a crisis situation, even and especially when there are no final answers. We should communicate about doubts. We should talk about limitation, about study designs, which is what Christian Drosten, as I told you, does very often. Explain how scientific studies are made and how they come to their conclusions and results, and why this occasionally might generate some question marks. And this communication about limitations includes the expertise of our scientific experts themselves. It's not seldom that I ask one of them a question and they frankly say why they can only answer it partly or why they can't really answer it. Because this is what makes them trustworthy, what improves people's confidence in them, because they are talking about their limitations as well. Because they mostly do not talk about their own research when it's not yet peer-reviewed. Sometimes they do, but mostly they don't. They talk about the research of others, and they do not claim to have an answer on everything in the pandemic, but stick to their own specialty. And so people then obviously are willing to learn and to think by themselves. And so I think communication like this might improve what in Germany we call the scientific literacy. And last but not least, what pleases me a lot as a radio journalist, obviously audio, in this special case, podcast, is a medium that is especially suitable for complex items like science for a general audience. Reading a long and complicated text needs much more personal effort than listening to a competent person who explains these things in spoken language. It's like, sometimes it's like sitting with someone at the table in the kitchen with a glass of wine, or listening to a very well-made and maybe even somehow entertaining academic lecture, as we sometimes try to be a little entertaining as far as this is possible in this situation. And finally, I suggest in a crisis like this, it might be a good way to form a temporary alliance between journalism and scientific experts. Yes, we need to be independent and critical, but if the limitations of knowledge and expertise are communicated, there's no need to push a controversy just to prove we are independent, because we still are, as we check out other sources in advance. But we need the expertise of the scientists. The flood of information is far beyond from what a single journalist, even what good science journalists can cite and judge, especially when we talk about preprint studies that are not peer-reviewed yet. But keep in mind, sometimes people only read the headlines. So when journalists take out small pieces, we have to work even more thoroughly on them than we do with big pieces, or at least we should work with high attention. We should be very alert, especially on social media. We should not simplify where we can't without a loss. That means distortion. And we have a special responsibility for all the scientists who are especially exposed in this situation. So that's it for me to now. I hope, and there may be questions, and there's a response from Berber.
Thank you very much, Korinna. Thank you. Yeah, I think there will be very many questions. I hardly could write down all my questions while you were speaking. But we should start with Berber, because so we invited Berber, who is from our own department. She's an assistant professor at the Faculty of Linguistics, at the Faculty of Arts, I should say. I'm so sorry. At the Faculty of Arts, and she's an assistant professor in media studies, and so an expert in media. And we would first like to hear her response, and then there will be open questions for everybody to ask.
Thank you so much, Korinna, for taking us behind the scenes of Das Coronavirus Update. And also my thanks to the center, of course, for the invitation and for also hosting, of course, this platform where we very critically ask questions like Korinna does in her podcast. And here we are also investigating, of course, what humanities can really add in this pandemic time. So we've already heard Korinna, of course, talking about the different learnings when creating the podcast, and also how the podcast can contribute to also empowering the audience and also enabling the audience and creating scientific literacy. And I was interested in your own background, of course, as a journalist and radio maker, in how you tackle these specific issues in this time. And I would like to introduce this question by talking about two particular tendencies today, which we also study in media studies. And I was wondering how you tackle this. And of course, you already addressed these. But I will introduce the question by talking about these two trends that we really are facing within this very challenging time of the pandemic. When we talk about the news that we have to tackle, the news is of course very much increasingly disruptive and also cross-medial. There's such a torrent of different events and information, and there has already been research on this by, for instance, Ingrid Volkmer, who was a collaborative study, News in Public Memory, and she talked about this, that the time we live in now, our media time, we have this type of flow frameworks, and the type of political affairs that take place are constantly taking place in global prime time. They're formatted as breaking news, delivered into our living rooms around the world, instantaneously, continuously. And as she describes in her work, this constantly demands action and reaction from us. So there's this constant presence of crisis and conflict, this never-ending stream of disruptive media events. So as a journalist, I was wondering, how do you tackle, of course, this very particular tendency of the constant disruptive flow of information, this type of also association that we have to also as audiences have to constantly make. And this is the second trend, not just that we have this constant stream of disruptive events, but also today that we as audiences are very much used to making associations. We live in a so-called association society, as for instance Marcel Broersma or Henry Jenkins have researched. So we're very much used to making associations on different types of platforms and link this into a very logical narrative for ourselves. This also has been researched by talking about, for instance, audience having their own filter bubbles or information bubbles. So this is an especially challenging time for us all, but even more so as a content creator, a journalist, as yourself, having to face this constant flow of disruptive events and information, and also for audiences who are very much used to associating that information on different kinds of platforms for themselves. So I was wondering, firstly, I was interested in, you already talked about the podcast, how it came into its own. And I was hoping if you could tell us a little bit more about the particular production climate at NDR that also very much welcomed this type of science communication in the format that you described. So the production of the program at NDR, the climate that made it come into its own. And secondly, your own career and background as a journalist and a radio maker. How does this assist you when you have to tackle this? You talked about that you do the research, of course, for the program, that you make the questions and the dramaturgy And I was wondering how your own career is important, your own trajectory for when you select the different topics for the podcast, and also especially, of course, facing this overwhelming challenge of all these different types of information out there. So I hope that these two questions are clear, and thank you so much again for this very insightful talk. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Berber. And that's really interesting what you asked, because the production climate, yeah, it's, how can I say this? We could use more people, like everyone in media, as money is short, and especially science journalists are not the ones who for all times have been in the focus of all the publishing chiefs. So sometimes it was more like a niche we had to work in. But what we do and what helps me in this flood of information is that I have a colleague who works very close with me, who's my podcast producer. In the beginning, we did this alternately. There was another colleague presenting the podcast as a host, but she's now in a different house. And so this was just a situation in the beginning. But my producer is also editor, and she's reading a lot, although she's not a science journalist. So she's doing different things. But in this crisis, she just came into it by chance, like a lot of things happened by chance. And she reads a lot, and she provides me with things I don't really see, because what I do is I try to focus. And because we have this flood of information, it somehow as well by chance happens like that, because I don't have the time to consume everything on mass media that everyone in the audience does. So I watch very, very little television. I watch no talk shows, especially because I already have done the deep dive into the whole course. And when I watch a talk show, I can't stand that the experts just get very small questions, and when they start to talk about a complex thing, then the next one is coming up like shooting at them all the time, and there's so little information, especially for me, as I have read a lot more. And well, I focus on the studies, and I focus a lot, which is quite interesting nowadays, on Twitter, because the scientists communicate a lot via Twitter. They post the preprint stories, studies there, and there's a lot of communication. And by the way, on Twitter, of course, as on every social media, there's a lot of communication by normal people who are concerned. But what happens there, and this is the second important thing, is that this is sort of an information bubble. And this is why the questions from the audience, although nowadays we are often not able to address these questions because they are too specific or too political or whatever, but it gives us sort of a chance to have the temperature of the whole climate in the public, to see where there's a lack of information. Because what is quite difficult when you deal with an issue like that for a year now, and I do very little other work during this pandemic, just very, very little other journalistic work on sciences. So it's important not to stick too much to that bubble. And that's why it's important for me to have this colleague who reads a lot more mass media. And I have another colleague, a freelance journalist, science journalist, who's doing a lot of research, so I don't miss anything while I'm so focused. But it happens quite often that one of them says, sends me a WhatsApp message or whatever, what about this new therapy? And I say, what therapy? Because I was just into virus evolution, like 2 hours reading a study, and I missed it. I almost missed it. What, for example, the health minister of health is that he's just bought a very important monoclonal antibodies medicament. So it needs a range of people working on this, but I have to admit, mostly on the content of the podcast, we're only 3 people. It could be more, but obviously it's okay like that, but it's quite difficult to sort out, not to stick too much to my own information bubble, but also not to, as I told you, not to reflect what every other newspaper and every other radio station does, because this is what I really, apart from the flood of studies we have here, the flood of discussion and information thrown out as headlines, as you just said, Berber, it's too much talking with too little information in my eyes. And the other thing that you just talked about my background, it's quite hard for me because it's hard to understand everything. Now I'm very much into it. So I'm glad I had the chance to focus on the podcast, to read a lot, and now I'm far from a science journalist who has studied microbiology or whatever, but still I can understand a lot, and I read these studies and I mostly understand them. But what helps me, I think, so this disadvantage might be an advantage, because my head is maybe somewhat a little closer to the normal head of the audience, to the normal brain, because I think a little more than someone who's too much into it. I realize when our experts use technical terms, and it's hard because I'm so much into it that my colleague sometimes says, well, next time you again should explain this technical term. But I think I'm a little closer to it by my background. And as far as fake news and everything like that is concerned, I think, as I told you, I studied German language and literature and history and communications as well, journalism. So I'm quite used to look out for the missing link rhetorically when someone is talking about things and doesn't provide us with any proof or doesn't answer questions. I think this is my instruments I'm working with. And I think this might help me a lot, which people who have studied microbiology, if they are talented, of course, can do as well, maybe even better. But I have learned this. I have the instruments to focus on these things. And yeah, I think this is quite helpful. I hope this was an answer, or at least an answer.
Yes, thank you so much.